The autumn wind of 1873 cut through Emma, Hartwell's threadbare coat like a knife, as she stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Silverbrook, Montana Territory. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the crumpled letter that had brought her across half. The country a letter from Thomas McKenzie, a rancher seeking a wife through correspondence. At 28, Emma had exhausted her options back in Philadelphia. The textile mill had closed. Her landlord had threatened eviction, and winter was approaching fast. Marriage to a stranger seemed preferable to freezing on the streets. The town stretched before her like something from a fever dream, wooden storefronts, weathered gray by mountain winds, horses tied to hitching posts, and men in wide-brimmed hats who stared at her with undisguised curiosity. Emma pulled her worn shawl tighter, acutely aware of her patched dress and scuffed boots. She had sold everything of value weeks ago, just to afford the train ticket dot, before we discover how this desperate decision changes everything for both Emma and Thomas. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us share more untold stories of courage from the frontier. Miss Hartwell? The voice was deep, hesitant. Emma turned to see a tall man approaching, his face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim. When he lifted his head, her breath caught. The left side of Thomas McKenzie's face bore the angry red scars of what looked like old burn marks, stretching from his temple to his jaw. His right eye was milky white, clearly blind. Emma's first instinct was to step back, but something in his good eye, a mixture of vulnerability and steely determination, kept her rooted in place. This was the man whose letters had been so eloquent, so gentle in their descriptions of his ranch and his hopes for a partnership built on mutual respect. Mr. McKenzie, she managed, extending her gloved hand. I'm Emma. Thomas hesitated before taking her hand, his own calloused from years of ranch work. I should have mentioned in my letters about my appearance. If you want to take the next stage back east, I'll pay your fare. The offer hung between them like morning mist. Emma studied his face, not just the scars, but the way he held himself with quiet dignity despite expecting rejection. She thought of her empty purse, her lack of prospects, and the growing desperation that had driven her to this frontier town. But more than that, she remembered his letters describing sunrise over the Rockies and his dream of building something lasting. I came here to start fresh, Mr. McKenzie. We both did. Relief flickered across his features. The ranch is about an hour's ride. I brought the wagon. He gestured toward a sturdy buckboard where two horses waited patiently as they loaded her single trunk into the wagon. Emma noticed how Thomas moved with practiced efficiency, despite his partial blindness. His hands were gentle with her belongings, careful with the horses. The townspeople they passed greeted him with genuine respect, though Emma caught the sideways glances directed at her, the mail-order bride, who'd come to marry the scarred rancher. The ride to the ranch passed in comfortable silence at first. The Montana landscape unfolded around them in shades of gold and amber, vast meadows giving way to rolling hills dotted with cattle. The air was cleaner than anything Emma had breathed in Philadelphia, sharp with the scent of pine and approaching winter. The fire happened 3 years ago, Thomas said suddenly, his voice steady but quiet. Lightning struck the barn during a summer storm. I was inside trying to save the horses. He touched his scarred cheek unconsciously. Lost the sight in my left eye, but I saved 5 horses that night. Emma found herself studying his profile as he spoke. The scars told a story of courage, of a man who ran toward danger instead of away from it. Were you alone then? Had a wife before, Sarah. She died in childbirth 2 years before the fire, along with our son. His hands tightened on the reins. Been alone since then. Started thinking maybe I was meant to be alone. The raw honesty in his voice made Emma's chest tighten. She understood loneliness, understood the kind of desperation that made you question your worth. I lost my parents to cholera when I was 22. Been on my own since then, working in the mills, barely scraping by. When they closed the factory, she trailed off, not wanting to voice how close to destitution she'd come. Thomas nodded slowly. We both know what it's like to lose everything. The ranch came into view as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across a well-maintained homestead. The main house was larger than Emma had expected, built from local timber with a wide front porch. A new barn stood where the old one had burned, and she could see cattle grazing in distant pastures. Despite his scars and his solitude, Thomas McKenzie had clearly built something substantial here. As they pulled up to the house, Thomas turned to her with an expression that was both hopeful and guarded. Emma, I want you to know this arrangement between us. It doesn't have to be anything you're not comfortable with. You have your own room, your own space. We can take whatever time you need to see if this might work. Emma met his gaze, seeing past the scars to the decent man beneath. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. I appreciate that, Thomas. I truly do. He helped her down from the wagon, his touch lingering just a moment, longer than necessary. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Emma pulled her shawl closer as Thomas carried her trunk to the front door. Inside, the house was clean, but Spartan functional furniture, bare walls, everything organized with military precision. It was the home of a man who had forgotten how to live for pleasure, who survived rather than thrived. Emma felt a sudden pang of sympathy for this scarred stranger who had offered her shelter. Your room is upstairs, second door on the left, Thomas said, setting down her trunk. Mine is at the end of the hall, bathrooms between them. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I usually eat supper around 6. You're welcome to join me, or I can leave something on the stove for you if you prefer to eat alone. The formality in his voice told Emma volumes about his expectations or lack thereof. He was prepared for her to treat this as purely a business arrangement, nothing more intimate than two strangers sharing living quarters. I'd like to eat with you, she said softly. If that's all right. Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to cautious pleasure. I'd like that too. That first evening set the tone for what followed. They shared a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, their conversation polite but careful. Thomas asked about her journey west, and Emma inquired about the ranch's operations. Neither ventured into more personal territory, but Emma found herself studying her new husband's face when he wasn't looking. The scars were extensive, she realized, not just on his cheek, but extending down his neck and disappearing beneath his shirt collar. The blind eye gave him a slightly off-kilter appearance, but his remaining eye was warm brown and remarkably expressive. When he smiled, which he did once when she complimented his cooking, the scarred skin pulled tight but couldn't hide the genuine warmth that transformed his features. Later, as Emma unpacked her few possessions in the small bedroom Thomas had prepared for her, she reflected on the day's revelations. Her new husband was not the rugged frontier man she had imagined, but neither was he the desperate bachelor seeking any woman who would have him. He was something more complex, a man marked by tragedy, but not broken by it, someone who had learned to expect little from life, but still maintained enough hope to send for a mail-order bride as she settled into the narrow bed. Emma heard Thomas moving around downstairs, banking the fire and checking the locks with the methodical precision of a long habit. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to discover whether this arrangement could become something more than mere survival. For tonight, though, she was warm, safe, and cautiously optimistic about the future she had chosen. Outside, her window, the Montana wind whistled through the pines, carrying the promise of winter and change. Chapter 2. The first weeks at the McKenzie ranch passed in a careful dance of politeness and mutual assessment. Emma threw herself into domestic tasks with a determination that surprised even her. The house had been neglected during Thomas's years of bachelorhood. Not dirty, but lacking the touches that made a house a home. She cleaned windows until they sparkled, mended curtains, and cooked meals that filled the kitchen with warmth and savory aromas. Thomas, for his part, maintained a respectful distance while clearly appreciating her efforts. He would compliment her cooking with genuine gratitude, and Emma noticed how his shoulders seemed to relax when he came in from the cold to find the house warm and welcoming. Still, they circled each other like wary animals, each afraid of presuming too much. The first crack in their careful formality came during a fierce October storm. Emma had been in the kitchen preparing supper when the wind picked up, howling around the house with increasing intensity. Through the window, she saw Thomas struggling to secure the barn doors as rain lashed across the yard in sheets. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and ran outside into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her sideways, but she pushed forward, reaching Thomas just as he was fighting to slide the heavy wooden bar across the barn doors. "Get back inside," he shouted over the wind, but Emma had already grabbed the other end of the bar. Together, they muscled it into place just as a massive gust tried to tear the doors from their hinges. They stood there for a moment, soaked too, the skin and breathing hard, before Thomas grabbed her hand and they ran for the house. Once inside, dripping on the kitchen floor, they looked at each other and suddenly burst into laughter, the first genuine, unguarded moment they'd shared. "You're soaked through," Thomas said, his good eye bright with something that might have been admiration. "You should get into dry clothes before you catch pneumonia." Emma nodded, but as she turned to go, she caught sight of him in profile. Water dripping from his dark hair, his scarred face lit by lamplight. The scars didn't frighten her any more, if anything. They spoke to his character, his willingness to sacrifice for others. She found herself thinking he was rather handsome, in a rugged, weathered way. "Thomas," she said softly. He turned toward her, and she felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "Thank you. For giving me a chance. For not making assumptions about why I came here." His expression grew serious. "We both came to this arrangement out of necessity, Emma. But necessity doesn't have to mean settling for less than we deserve." The words hung between them, weighted with possibility neither had dared to acknowledge before. The next morning brought the season's first snow, and with it, a new rhythm to their days. Emma learned to help with the livestock, discovering she had a natural way with the horses. Thomas taught her to milk the cows and collect eggs, his patient instruction revealing a gentleness she hadn't expected. "Easy there, Buttercup," Emma murmured to the temperamental Mare as she brushed her coat. The horse had taken an immediate liking to Emma, much to Thomas's surprise. "She's never been that calm with strangers," he observed, leaning against the stall door. "You have a gift with animals." Emma felt a flush of pride at his praise. In Philadelphia, her only skills had been factory work and basic housekeeping. Here, she was discovering abilities she'd never known she possessed. One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after supper, Thomas surprised her by pulling out a leather-bound book. "I used to read to Sarah in the evenings," he said quietly. Would you like me to read aloud sometimes?" Emma nodded, settling into the chair across from him. His voice was rich and warm as he read passages from Charles Dickens, and she found herself watching his face in the firelight, seeing past the scars to the intelligence and sensitivity beneath. When he looked up and caught her studying him, neither of them looked away immediately. "Emma," he said slowly, "I want you to know that you're not what I expected when I placed that advertisement." Her heart sank. "I know I'm not much to look at." "No," he interrupted firmly. "You're stronger than I expected. braver, kinder. When I wrote those letters, I was hoping for a housekeeper who might tolerate my company. Instead, I got ... double quotes. He paused, seeming to search for words. I got a partner. The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Emma felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Their first real test came in early November, when Thomas fell ill with a fever that left him weak and disoriented. Emma nursed him through 3 days of chills and delirium, sitting by his bedside, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, and coaxing him to drink broth. On the second night, in his fever, he called out for Sarah. Emma felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, followed immediately by guilt. Of course he would think of his first wife, the woman he'd chosen freely, not out of desperation. But when his fever finally broke, and he woke to find Emma asleep in the chair beside his bed, his first words were, "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," she said simply, and something in his good eye told her that this simple act of care had meant more to him than she could have imagined. As he recovered, Thomas began sharing more details about his past. He told Emma about Sarah, how they'd met at a church social in town, their courtship, their dreams for the ranch. Instead of making Emma feel like an inadequate replacement, these stories helped her understand the depth of loss Thomas carried, and the courage it had taken for him to risk loving again. "She would have liked you," Thomas said one evening as they worked together preparing dinner. "Sarah was practical like you, but with a gentle heart. She would have appreciated how you've made this house a home again." Emma's hands stilled on the potatoes she was peeling. "Do you think ... do you think she would mind? About us, I mean." Thomas considered this seriously. "Sarah was the most generous person I ever knew. She would want me to be happy, and she would want whoever shared my life to be cared for properly." He paused in his stirring of the stew. "I think she would be glad I found someone who sees past these scars to the man underneath." As November progressed into December, their conversations grew longer, more intimate. Thomas told her about his dreams for the ranch, his plans to expand the herd and maybe plant an orchard. Emma shared her own dreams, modest ones, mostly about having a home, a place where she belonged. The work was hard but satisfying. Emma's hands grew calloused from ranch chores, her arms stronger from hauling water and feed. She learned to read the weather signs, to judge the mood of the cattle, to anticipate what needed doing before Thomas had to ask. One particularly cold morning, as they worked together to break ice on the water troughs, Emma slipped on a patch of frozen ground. Thomas caught her before she could fall, his strong arms pulling her against his chest. For a moment they stood there, her hands pressed against his coat, his scarred face inches from hers. "Careful," he murmured, his breath visible in the cold air. "I'm fine," she whispered back, but neither of them moved away immediately. Something was building between them, something that went beyond gratitude or convenience. Emma could feel it in the way Thomas's gaze lingered on her face, in the careful way he touched her hand when passing her something at dinner, in the comfortable silences that stretched between them in the evenings. One night in early December, as the first heavy snow began to fall, Thomas looked across the dinner table at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Emma," he said carefully, Do you think this could be more than just a business arrangement?" Her breath caught. She'd been wondering the same thing for weeks, but hadn't dared to hope he might feel it too. "I think," she said. "Slowly, it already is." The smile that spread across Thomas's scarred face was radiant, transforming his features with pure joy. "I was hoping you might feel that way." That night, for the first time since her arrival, Thomas kissed her goodnight. Gentle brush of lips against her forehead that left Emma's heart racing as she climbed the stairs to her room. Change was coming. She could feel it in the winter wind and in the growing warmth in Thomas's eyes when he looked at her. Chapter 3, December, brought a cold snap that tested both the ranch's resources and the growing bond between Emma and Thomas. When a 3-day blizzard trapped them inside the house, they found themselves truly comfortable together for the first time. The storm raged outside while they sat by the fire, sharing stories from their pasts that revealed the depth of their respective journeys to this moment. Emma told Thomas about her childhood in a Philadelphia orphanage, the grim years working in textile mills where the air was thick with cotton dust and the hours stretched from dawn to dusk. She spoke of the loneliness that had become her constant companion, the way she'd learned to expect little from life and to be grateful for basic survival. Thomas, in turn, shared memories of learning ranching from his father, of Sarah's laugh, echoing through the house they'd planned to fill with children, and of the devastating night when fever took both his wife and newborn son within hours of each other. "I thought God was punishing me," he admitted quietly, his fingers tracing the wood grain of the mantelpiece. "First Sarah and the baby, then the fire. Started to believe I wasn't meant for happiness." Emma rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his scarred one. "Maybe God wasn't punishing you, Thomas. Maybe he was preparing you for something different, something better." He turned to study her face in the firelight. "Do you really believe that?" "I believe we both needed to be broken down before we could be built back up into the people we were meant to be," she said softly. "Strong enough to appreciate what we have when we find it." It was during this storm that Thomas first glimpsed the full extent of Emma's inner strength. When the wind tore a section of roofing loose, threatening to let snow into the house, Emma didn't hesitate to climb into the cramped attic space to help him nail boards over the gap. She worked without complaint despite the bitter cold, her practical nature and steady nerves proving invaluable. "Where did you learn to be so fearless?" Thomas asked as they climbed back down, both covered in sawdust and shivering. "I learned that being afraid doesn't change anything," Emma replied, brushing debris from her hair. "Might as well do what needs doing." Christmas approached with a quiet joy neither of them had expected to feel again. Emma made decorations from pine branches and strips of fabric, while Thomas surprised her by carving a small wooden angel for the mantelpiece. The simple figure bore Sarah's gentle expression, and Emma understood it was Thomas's way of including his first wife in their new beginning, rather than trying to erase her memory. On Christmas Eve they exchanged gifts by the fire. Thomas had ordered a warm woolen shawl from town for Emma, dyed a deep blue that brought out her eyes. She gave him a pair of leather gloves she'd spent weeks sewing in secret, lined with rabbit fur and carefully stitched to accommodate his work-hardened hands. "They're beautiful, Emma," he said, running his fingers over the careful stitching. "Thank you." "They're practical," she corrected, but she was pleased by his obvious appreciation. "I have something else for you," Thomas said quietly, pulling out a small wooden box with nervous fingers. Inside was a simple gold ring, not ornate, but beautiful in its craftsmanship. Emma's breath caught as she recognized the significance of the gesture. "It was my mother's," Thomas explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to a woman who would understand its value wasn't in the gold, but in the promise it represented." He met her eyes. "Emma, I know we married for practical reasons, but I've come to care for you deeply. More than care for you. I love you." The words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes as she lifted the ring from the box. It fit perfectly on her finger, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "I love you too, Thomas," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to say those words to anyone." When he kissed her that night, it was with the gentle reverence of a man who had learned not to take love for granted. Emma felt as if she were finally truly home. The new year brought challenges that tested their partnership in different ways. A harsh January left several cattle dead from the cold, straining the ranch's already tight finances. Emma worked alongside Thomas in the bitter weather, helping to move the surviving herd to shelter, her hands cracking from the cold despite her new gloves. One evening, as they tallied their losses by lamplight, Thomas's shoulders sagged with the weight of responsibility. "We might not make it through until spring," he said quietly, running his hand through his hair. "The feed situation is worse than I thought, and if we lose more cattle, ... Emma studied their ledger books, her practical mind working through possibilities. Before coming to Montana, she'd managed the household finances during her parents' final illness, stretching every penny to cover medicine and food. Those skills served her well now. "What about selling some of the horses?" she suggested. "We have more than we need for ranch work, and good horses bring better prices than cattle right now." Thomas looked up at her in surprise. "Those horses are some of the best bloodstock in the territory. My father spent years developing that breeding program. And they'll still be good bloodstock next year, when we can afford to keep them all," Emma replied practically. "But they won't do us any good if we lose the ranch entirely." It was a difficult decision, but ultimately a wise one. Thomas sold 6 of his finest horses to neighboring ranches, the pain of parting with his father's legacy evident in his face. But the money was enough to buy feed and see them through to spring, and more importantly, it showed Emma how much Thomas had come to trust her judgment. "I never had anyone to share these decisions with before," he told her one evening as they planned improvements for the coming year. It's good not to carry everything alone." By February, their marriage had deepened into something neither had dared to hope for when they'd first exchanged those careful letters. They worked together with an easy rhythm, anticipated each other's needs, and shared quiet moments of contentment that felt more precious than any luxury. Emma had learned to read Thomas's moods, understanding when his scarred eye ached in cold, weather and quietly preparing willow bark tea without being asked. Thomas, in turn, noticed when the isolation of ranch life weighed on Emma, making sure to plan trips to town or invite neighbors over for Sunday dinner. One snowy evening in late February, as they prepared for bed, Thomas caught Emma's reflection in the mirror as she brushed her hair by candlelight. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Coming here? Marrying me?" Emma turned to face him, seeing the vulnerability that still sometimes flickered in his expression. Even now, months into their marriage, he occasionally seemed surprised that she had chosen to stay, that she saw past his scars to the man beneath. "Thomas McKenzie," she said firmly, moving to stand before him, "marrying you was the smartest thing I ever did. I came here looking for shelter, but I found something I never even knew I wanted." "What's that?" "A home. A real home with someone who loves me not despite my past, but because of everything that brought me here." She reached up to trace the scarred side of his face gently. "These scars don't make you less beautiful to me, Thomas. They make you more precious, because they show me the kind of man you are, brave enough to risk everything for others, strong enough to keep going after losing everything." Thomas caught her hand against his cheek, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd feel grateful for that fire, but if it hadn't happened, I might never have sent for a mail-order bride, might never have found you. We found each other," Emma corrected gently. "Two broken people who learned to be whole together." As winter began its slow retreat toward spring, Emma reflected on the transformation that had taken place, not just in her circumstances, but in her heart. She had come to Montana Territory as Emma Hartwell, a desperate woman with nothing to offer but her willingness to work. She would face the future as Emma McKenzie, a rancher's wife and partner, beloved and loving in return. Chapter 4. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it new life to the ranch and a deepening of the love that had bloomed between Emma and Thomas throughout the long winter months. As the snow melted and revealed green grass beneath, Emma felt as if she were seeing the world with new eyes that belonged to a woman who had found her place in life. The first test of their renewed season came when Emma discovered she was carrying Thomas's child. The realization filled her with both joy and terror, knowing how deeply his first wife's death in childbirth had affected him. She chose to tell him on a warm April evening as they sat on the front porch, watching as sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "Thomas," she began carefully, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach, "I have something to tell you, and I'm not sure how you'll feel about it." He turned from his contemplation of the horizon to study her face, immediately alert to the serious tone in her voice. "What is it, Emma?" "I'm with child." The words came out in a rush, followed by silence that stretched between them like a held breath. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and finally, a tentative joy that made Emma's heart skip. "Are you certain?" She nodded. "As certain as I can be. I know this brings back difficult memories for you, Thomas, and if you need time to—" He silenced her with a gentle kiss, his scarred hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "Emma McKenzie, you have just given me the most precious gift imaginable. A chance to be a father again, with a woman strong enough to face whatever comes." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months, with Emma continuing to work alongside Thomas as her body allowed. The doctor in Silverbrook proclaimed her healthy and strong, predicting no complications, but Thomas still hovered anxiously, remembering too well the fragility of life. "You don't need to treat me like spun glass," Emma laughed one afternoon, when Thomas insisted on carrying a bucket of water that she could have easily managed. "I'm having a baby, not dying of consumption." "Humor me," he replied, setting the bucket down near the garden they planted together. "I've already lost one family. I couldn't bear to lose another." Emma's expression softened with understanding. She took his scarred hands in hers, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work and dedication. "Thomas, look at me. I'm not Sarah, and this isn't then. I'm strong, the baby is healthy, and Dr. Morrison says everything is progressing perfectly. You can't protect us from life by wrapping us in cotton." Their neighbors rallied around them as Emma's due date approached in late autumn. Mrs. Peterson, the wife of a nearby rancher, came to stay for the final weeks, bringing practical wisdom and gentle humor that helped ease Thomas's anxiety. She regaled them with stories of her own 6 successful deliveries, making childbirth seem like a natural process rather than a death sentence. "Your Thomas is a good man, but he's got the nervous father disease something fierce," Mrs. Peterson confided to Emma one afternoon as they prepared preserves for the winter. "Seen it before in men who've lost a wife in childbed. They forget that women have been having babies since the beginning of time." When labor finally began on a crisp October morning, Thomas proved both stalwart and nearly useless, pacing the kitchen while Mrs. Peterson and Dr. Morrison attended Emma in the bedroom above. The sounds from upstairs, Emma's controlled breathing, punctuated by occasional groans of effort, sent him into a state of barely controlled panic. "Son, you're wearing a hole in my floor," Mrs. Peterson observed during one of her trips downstairs for supplies. "Why don't you go check on the horses or something useful?" But Thomas couldn't bear to be away from the house, couldn't stop himself from listening for any change in the sounds from above. When Emma's labor intensified in the afternoon, her cries of pain nearly sent him charging up the stairs, despite explicit orders to stay away. "She's strong, Thomas," Dr. Morrison assured him during a brief break. "Stronger than most. This is hard work, but it's good, normal work. Trust in her." As the sun began to set, filling the house with golden light, a new sound joined Emma's labored. Breathing the strong, indignant cry of a newborn baby. Thomas froze in the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for some indication of Emma's condition. "Mr. Mackenzie," Dr. Morrison's voice called down the stairs. "Come meet your son." Thomas took the stairs 2 at a time, finding Emma propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the quilts she'd sewn during her pregnancy. The baby was red-faced and furious at his sudden eviction from the warm darkness, but he was clearly healthy and strong. "Emma," Thomas breathed, settling carefully on the edge of the bed. "Are you all right? Are you hurt?" She laughed weakly. "I'm tired and sore, but I'm fine, Thomas. We're both fine." She shifted the bundle so he could see the baby's face more clearly. "Your son wants to meet you." With trembling hands, Thomas accepted the tiny weight of his child, marveling at the perfect fingers and the dark hair that already showed a tendency to curl like his own. The baby opened his eyes and seemed to study his father's scarred face with serious concentration. "He's beautiful," Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Perfect. Emma, he's absolutely perfect. What shall we name him?" Emma asked, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny fist. Thomas considered for a moment, thinking of his father, his first son who had never drawn breath, and the new beginning this child represented. "James," he said finally. "James Samuel Mackenzie. James for your father, Samuel for mine." "James Samuel Mackenzie," Emma repeated, testing the sound of it. "Jimmy, I like it." The months that followed brought the particular exhaustion and joy that comes with a new baby, but also a deepening sense of family and purpose that neither Emma nor Thomas had experienced before. Jimmy proved to be a healthy, happy baby who rarely fussed and seemed to thrive under the attention of his devoted parents. Thomas, who had been terrified of his capacity to love and lose again, found himself completely besotted with his son. He would sit by the cradle for hours, talking to Jimmy about the ranch, the horses, and the mountains visible through the bedroom window. Emma would find him there in the early morning, still in his work clothes, having stopped to check on the baby and been unable to leave. "He's going to be spoiled beyond redemption if you keep this up," she teased one evening, finding Thomas feeding Jimmy while she prepared supper. "A man's first duty is to his family," Thomas replied seriously, then smiled as Jimmy grabbed his finger with surprising strength. "Besides, I have 17 years of fathering to make up for. I don't intend to waste any of it." As winter approached again, bringing with it the first anniversary of Emma's arrival in Silverbrook, both she and Thomas reflected on the tremendous changes that had transformed their lives. The ranch was thriving, their love had grown deeper and stronger, and now they had a son to carry forward the legacy they were building together. One evening in December, as they sat by the fire with Jimmy sleeping peacefully in Emma's arms, Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "I have something for you," he said quietly. "An anniversary gift of sorts." Emma accepted the paper with a free hand and unfolded it carefully. It was the deed to the ranch, now bearing both their names as legal owners. Emma Mackenzie was listed as full partner in the Mackenzie Ranch and Cattle Company. "Thomas," she whispered, looking up at him with shining eyes. "You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did," he interrupted gently. "This ranch, this life we've built, it belongs to both of us equally. You've worked just as hard as I have to make it succeed, and you deserve to know it's as much yours as mine." Emma felt tears spill over as she looked down at the legal document. That represented so much more than property ownership. It was recognition, respect, and tangible proof of Thomas's love and trust. "1 year ago, I stepped off that stage with nothing but the clothes on my back and a head full of desperate hopes," she said softly. "I thought I was selling myself for shelter, settling for whatever scraps of life I could get." Thomas moved closer on the settee, his arm going around both his wife and child. And instead, Emma leaned into his warmth, feeling Jimmy's tiny weight against her chest and Thomas's steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. Instead, I found everything I never dared to dream. A home, a family, a man who sees me not as a burden to be tolerated, but as a gift to be treasured. The gift was mine, Emma McKenzie, Thomas said quietly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You saved me from a life of just surviving and taught me how to live again. Outside, snow began to fall softly over the ranch, covering the land, in pristine white and promising another season of challenges and growth ahead. But inside the warm house, 3 hearts beat in quiet contentment, bound together by love that had grown from desperation into something beautiful and lasting. Emma had come west seeking shelter and found her destiny. Thomas had sent for a mail order, bride, and received a partner worthy of his deepest devotion. Together, they had built something that would endure, not just a successful ranch, but a family legacy rooted in love, respect, and the courage to trust in second chances.